This week, I'm back temporarily on Application Security Weekly, filling in for some hosts who couldn't join us this week. So don't get too upset or excited because I won't be a regular back on the show. I'm just filling in for our first segment in where we'll interview Allan Friedman, the Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives at the NTIA U.S. Department of Commerce, to talk about the software bill of materials. In the application security news, GitHub seeks security dominance with developers. IoT and agile frameworks, are they partners, friend, or foe? White Source acquires and open sources the Renovate Dependency Update toolset. Java versus Python. Which should you consider? Either or both, maybe. Stay tuned for all that and more on this edition of Application Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/ASW and use the code ASW30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies. Protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week, Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences. Demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Welcome to Application Security Weekly, episode number 88, recorded on December 9th, 2019 at G-Unit Studios here in Rhode Island. At least I'm in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. My co-host, John Kinsella, is all the way across the country. John, welcome to Application Security Weekly.
Paul, what are you doing here?
I know, it's weird, right?
Looking sharp.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm very excited. You know, when you run and found a small business like I have, I've had to wear a lot of hats. I had to wear the sales hat for a while, have to wear the marketing hat for a while. I've worn the host and co-host thing since the beginning, but a lot of the other business functions, including application developer, I've worn that hat most recently, and now we have a full-time developer. So I only have to put that hat on every once in a while now, which is cool because it gives me lots of great experiences to draw upon.
I'm hearing you're doing all sorts of great things.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. I'm currently putting together my plan for 2020 in content, so that's going to be exciting. And of course, our listener feedback survey will be very instrumental in forming that. So if you haven't filled out our survey, I don't know where that was in our announcements, but it seemed like a natural segue to go into that. So we will be running a listener feedback survey. You can visit securityweekly.com, click the survey tab, and fill that out. Also next year, we'll be at InfoSec World 2020, March 30th through April 1st at Disney's Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners get 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. You can go to securityweekly.com/ISW 2020, click the register button, and register with our discount code. I mixed up the announcement, so I'll skip that one and do it on the next segment, and hopefully it'll come out okay. So that is just scrolling by my teleprompter for those listening at home or in your car or in the gym. But this segment, I would like to welcome Mr. Allan Friedman, Dr. Allan Friedman. That's in your official thing. You didn't tell me that before. The Director of Cybersecurity at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the U.S. Department of Commerce. That's a mouthful. Currently, you're spearheading the software bill of materials initiatives. Is that correct?
That's right. We have the rather humble idea that you should know about as much as what's in critical infrastructure as you do what's inside a Twinkie. And so wouldn't it be great if software came with a list of ingredients so that you knew what the third-party components were? Lovely idea. Turns out making it a reality involves actually bringing together the entire software supply chain and helping folks realize the value of having this kind of transparency.
And it's a difficult analogy to compare recipes and ingredients to software, right? Because I even think when we look on the back of the package and we look at the ingredients, we're like, what's that? I mean, do we go down to like the molecule level on ingredients, right? Because when we look at software, other modules include other modules. Those modules include the whole thing. So it can be tricky to figure out exactly what software is running inside of your software.
And we do have that in ingredients, right? If your cookie comes with chocolate, it will say, but chocolate is composed of these things. Mm-hmm. And the other reason that I like the analogy is, and you're right, it's not perfect, but most of the time you may not care. Right? Most of the time you buy it for its features, its properties, its deliciousness. In the food example, however, if there's someone in your world that is allergic or has a food sensitivity, then it's really important that the data is there and that you can access it in an easy-to-use fashion. And that data is available to do scanning so that when someone comes up to your house, you don't have to do just a single time approach. So I think there's some real value with that. And the final thing on the analogy side is there's a difference between a list of ingredients, which is here are the pieces, and a recipe, right? Mm. No one is saying you need to tell me exactly how this piece of software is made. But if you're using software that you didn't make yourself, because I trust you as the software vendor, but if you're using third-party software, then I need to know what I'm putting on my network. And frankly, you need to know what you're shipping.
Now, Allan, one thing we haven't discussed in prep for this that comes to mind is oftentimes open source licenses will mandate that or require that you disclose what's inside of your software, but that's not as encompassing as it needs to be in this case.
So I used to, when I was giving the talk, when I first started this, I had a tweet from Mudge where he put a picture using some of these open source disclosures saying that a Mercedes actually shipped with Netcat and libtiff. And so
wow.
The joke he set me up for is I'd throw the slide up, throw the picture of the car, throw the tweet, and I'd say, your brand new Mercedes came pre-owned.
Yeah.
So there is some value in the high-level licenses. You can flip open your iPhone. It'll list all of the basic high-level licenses. But it's not just enough to know that, right? The important thing, as we realize, that software is never perfect. It's never finished. And so tracking version number is really what you need to know from a security perspective. The licensing side, you just need to know the overall existence of the product. Versioning is, you need that level of granularity to know what's the potential risk.
And it's interesting how this problem came to be. And John, I know you're very close to the container side. It really wasn't until we could build things like containers on the fly and basically have the ingredients be pretty much dynamic, right? Like you can set it up. So I'm going to pull the latest version of, I'll use beautiful soup because when you're talking about ingredients for food, I immediately went to Python libraries that could also be food. And you every time you build, you might get a different version, right? So John, it was really the kind of evolution and adoption of containers and the DevOps process that led us to this problem being this severe.
I'm sort of curious to see where, on Allan's mind, actually, Allan, I want you to answer this first. From my point of view, I first started hearing about supply chain issues in the sort of earlier cloud days when people started using public resources in a cloudy type environment. That's when I started seeing talks and being on panels around how does that supply chain affect things. I'm wondering, does it go further back than that from your point of view, Allan?
The basic idea of tracking this, I think, comes from a number of different areas. One of the stories that I hear a lot is actually in the embedded device space, where there have been vulnerabilities that are in things that are really important. So when WannaCry was tearing across the internet, I talked to the CISO of one of the largest hospitals in America, most wealthy hospitals. Most hospitals don't have great IT teams. They're focused on saving lives. This organization actually has a whole security team. And he had to pull his entire team off the line and have them call up the medical device manufacturers to ask, hey, this blinking box that's keeping grandma alive, does it run Windows or Linux? Because that's the lack of transparency we have. The kicker, by the way, is one vendor gave the wrong answer, said it was Linux, it was vulnerable, it was Windows, it was vulnerable, and it was not patchable. And so that is sort of one side of transparency, which is just from the user perspective, the enterprise perspective, you can't defend what you don't know about. And so if you're using something, especially a legacy device that's going to be on your network for a while, making sure that you're aware of what your potential risk is so that you can make a decision down the road, that's really important. On the other side, gets exactly to where you were talking, Paul, of sort of this cloud build approach, where because I'm shipping things in such a dynamic fashion, right? I've got minutely builds. I need to have an automatic way of tracking what's being exposed. One of the challenges was trying to figure out is, does the customer care about that? Or is that something that we want to focus on for the build side? It's very hard to claim that you've managed to insert your sec wherever we're putting sec in DevOps these days. Hard to claim that you've inserted sec if you don't actually have some well understood way of tracking what you're shipping. And the naming part, just the transparency part, that's the table stakes. You can't do all of the supply chain security that we care about, such as whitelisting or blacklisting or some real-time risk analysis, until you have that data. We want to empower that and allow folks to start building tools and practices around that. But it starts with making sure that we know what we have. Right?
Is it accurate to say that there are really two major security issues here with respects to the software bill of materials? One being, there could be, the one we're talking about right now, is vulnerabilities inside of the code that I'm including or software I'm including inside of my product, right? The other is there a backdoor inside? Does someone else have control, right? Which is really a completely different issue. We're all like, I tend to misuse, just because I'm trying to talk off the cuff somewhat often during the week, threats, vulnerabilities, risk, exposures, and the subtle not even subtle differences between those, right? So I'm doubling this as like major security issues that would arise from this potential, from this topic, right?
And I think you're right that from one perspective, from a security perspective, it's very important to keep those as different aspects. However, I would argue, if from a security awareness perspective, the challenge is, once this threat has been identified, whether it is a vulnerability, a potential vulnerability, or some kind of injection, right? And one of the stories I like to tell is, suppose a library that you use and depend on has a brand new developer with a key that you've only ever seen from a different corner. So you haven't taken the time to look at what their commits are. You don't know if the community has done some QA, but you now can start to figure out, is this something we need to worry about? So that's the surveillance side. What we're focusing on is when there is a problem, where are you affected? And this is a surprisingly hard problem. I know of very few organizations on the entire planet where they can say confidently, when we find out about a new risk, we can instantly tell whether or not we might be affected. So there's a conference called FIRST, the Forum on Incident Response and Security Technologies. It's sort of the global hub of CCERT and PCERT teams. And this past year in June, there were not one, not two, but 3 different talks from very large, mature tech companies, where they were trying to get to that single pane of glass of what are our third-party software uses across our entire product families. And I don't think that's something that most folks have. We need to get there.
And to throw another kind of wrinkle in it too, vulnerability is an encompassing term as well. And sometimes vulnerabilities can be in the configuration. And so while there might not be a CVE for it, maybe it's not necessarily a buffer overflow or some other type of vulnerability that we can classify. It's that, and this just happened in a Java package that exposed the JMX debugging port, There wasn't really like a software mistake per se inside the code. It was, well, when we push this release, we accidentally confused the configuration and exposed this port, which means people can now execute code, right? So that just further complicates things, that there's multiple ways you can present this type of exposure, basically.
So, and I'm at the Department of Commerce, and one of the reasons that I've joined government about 5 years ago. One of the reasons that I went to commerce is because ultimately this has to be driven by market-based solutions, right? What I like about this approach is it allows us to think through specialization. So there can be folks who go off and look for typo squatting of Python libraries, for example, to pull something from the news. There can be folks who do this. Every organization can make a decision about what kind of threat information they want, what sources they want. Is CVE enough? Or do you want to go to one of the folks that actually specializes in finding flaws in software that aren't in the National Vulnerability Database? That's entirely up to you. What we want to make sure is that folks can take actionable intelligence based on that.
Let me throw this out there, see what sticks to the wall. We're talking about vulnerabilities as security vulnerabilities, and you over at Commerce. If you talk to the fine folks at Black Duck, we had Tim on from Synopsys a few weeks ago. One of the larger really sort of pots of money that's actually where they're getting their customers from is M&A. So think about that for a second, and I went through this obviously when I got acquired last year, and having to actually go through and come up with that bill of materials. You're not doing it specifically for security, but it's still something that requires a pretty good amount of time to do it. Luckily for us, we were lucky because I was on top of the AppSec side of things already. But is that on your radar? Do you think about that? We're really focused on security here, but what do you think?
So no, you're exactly right. In fact, I think you've captured one of the key reasons why we weren't doing this in the past. Because I think until quite recently, there were very few organizations that could confidently say that they weren't shipping GPL code, that everyone understood all of the licenses and that everyone is following the rules. That is now a much better understood risk. No one's going through exit without getting an open source audit to make sure that everything's kosher. And there are turnkey tools like Black Duck that can do that for you. So that has removed one of the bigger industry obstacles to moving forward on this. And it also allows us to think about what are these points of adoption? Because having this transparency of third-party code involves getting the entire supply chain involved, right? It's not just the components you're using, it's what are the components that they're using, and it's turtles all the way down or all the way back into the supply chain. And so looking into who are the folks that are going to care, and how do we try to make this a write once problem so that the first person who actually looks into, oh, that library, it turns out, depends on these libraries, that work only has to be done once so that we can make that happen.
I mean, you're almost shifting it left in not just development, but the maturity of the organization in terms of M&A, right? So while I'm developing the product, I want to realize, not me, but everyone who's developing a product, that, hey, if I include this library or this application, down the road, that could be problematic when I sell it, right? I think MySQL is an example of that, right? And there's multiple offshoots of open source and different licenses, and depending on how I use it, right? You want to make that shift to a different database potentially early in the process and have the tools available to you early on to make sure that you can build a product that when you get time to M&A or whatever, the next evolution of the company, that there's not a huge issue.
And I'll give you one more example where the M&A or that evolutionary approach can make a real difference is, right, in the day-to-day software development process that you guys have. And one of the reasons I love listening to your podcast is because you're spending all your time analyzing how would I apply this to my own company. But you're day-to-day. Right, you don't have the opportunity to have these punctuation points. One of the things that we forget is that, hey, projects change in how much support they get. And what's crazy is when you talk to people and say, you're using this component, and you pull it up on GitHub, and you're like, the last commit was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or there are only 2 developers involved in this, and they don't seem to be involved in anything else. So it allows you to start to do some awareness of the overall health of the ecosystem, right? There are orphan projects where you certainly don't want to tie the future of your product to something that doesn't have long-term support. or it gives you a chance to say, hey, listen, this component, we just don't think that the community behind it has the attention to security or other aspects, right? It could be quality, it could be a feature that you want, right? I've come across in the embedded space projects announcing we're no longer supporting single-threaded processors. That's great, shows you're a modern process. But on the other hand, it means that if you have a very lightweight device, you're not going to count on having support from this library, so you need to move on.
That's one of the dangers of using open source, is that the product management and or features are defined by usually the folks developing it, right? I mean, there's tons of open source projects. It's a generalization, right? Yeah. That someone has taken this on maybe as a hobby, as a tool to help themselves, and they're defining the requirements. And like you said, those could change. And we've seen that time and time again with open source to, make life difficult for some people, right? But if you're on a multi-threaded processor, it makes a lot of people a lot happier, because now the features are going to progress much more quickly because they only have to support one type of processor versus the other, right?
No, I think in the last few years, right, supply chain has become, 2019, 2020, 2021, those are all going to be the year of the supply chain discussion. The open source community, I think, has realized, we used to talk about open source versus commercial software in this great battle. It's clear that open source is won, but it's I love the analogy of the dog that caught the car, right? Now what? Now that we are all dependent on this, what I don't want to see is folks in, the Department of Defense go off and say, oh, we can't trust open source. What I do want to see is, let's enable, for very high assurance use cases, the kind of security surveillance that we need, because again, it is possible that there is all sorts of hinky stuff happening in online communities. So let's figure out, what are the libraries that my project depends on? And then let me start to make that part of my risk process, is to figure out, do we like the projects? Do we like the management team? And what are some of the automated tools that I can use to start to watch these components to say, hey, this is the stuff that I need to be worried about.
It's interesting to see how the concept of open source runs into these issues when we reach this scale, right? And if you go back in time, when there was a much smaller set of code that needed to be written, a much smaller set of developers, they used to call it back then bumming instructions, right? So they would leave, literally open source was, they'd leave the paper tapes in the drawer for anyone to access, so that other programmers could advance their software, right? And we didn't really, we had those issues back then, but it was on such a small scale, it was easy to overcome. You probably knew the person that put that paper tape in the drawer, right? You could go review that source code, because there wasn't all that source code to review. Now when we look at open source, there's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of lines of code likely out there, and who's reviewing it, who's watching it, and who's maintaining the trust, right? And I think in all the cases that we've seen, whether it's a Linux distribution, embedded device technology, or software language and or framework, who's maintaining that trust? How do we know whose software to trust? How do we know which developers I can or cannot trust? Who's the authoritative figure to maintain this trust model?
And I don't think we're ever going to get to that level. And that certainly doesn't mean that we should abandon open source. What I love is there are parts of the community that are starting to sort of create these features that we can engage. So the Linux Foundation now has this badge system. The Linux Foundation is actively involved in the work we're doing on SBOM, where they sort of can look at projects that say, okay, this community, the folks working on this have this type of approach. Oasis does a lot of great work on open source government, where they say, if you bring your open source project to Oasis, we'll give you some of that infrastructure and governance so that folks can look at your project and realize that it's trustworthy and can make it more sustainable. Because I think things do move very quickly. Sometimes that's wonderful. It means that a bunch of super high quality engineers from giant tech companies can parachute in, say, this is now something we can all use, and they're done. And the question is what happens when they don't have the sustainability for that? Well, no one's going to tell you. But so every person who's managing a software project has to actually manage their own bill of materials to say, what can I do? And I think we're going to see a lot more folks. There are already folks in the software intelligence business When I started promoting this idea and trying to bring the community together, I was worried that the vendor space and the source composition analysis toolset, like Synopsys, like Sonatype, like folks like that, we're going to try to stop us, because we were essentially suggesting that everyone give away what they provide for free. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that an SCA tool is not that hard to write. Like a good first-year master's student in computer science should be able to write that. At least a decent quality. The value add is the intelligence about which components should I care about. And that's what we're trying to get to, is make it so that more folks are in a position where they can start to pay attention to that.
Yeah, it's interesting as we look at typo squatting, and it's something that came up in the news again. And I started doing a little bit of research, and this isn't the first time it's come up in the news. Specifically, it's the third, at least from what I could tell, the third time in major news that Python libraries being typo squatted was covered. Of course, we've got similar issues with Node, similar issues with really any other language or framework that has those components that you can build. And I was kind of like, why haven't we solved this problem? Because my first thought was, well, look, when you search, if you just type in typo squatting into Google, the first results that you get, probably the only reason I didn't go as many pages as I could have, right, is all about domain name typo squatting. Very different computer science problem, right? I know the known good. I know that Amazon.com is my known good domain. Therefore, the software and methods and techniques that I use to figure out if there's any kind of typo squatting are very different from the library typo squatting, where we don't know who maintains the list of that Django is spelled Django and not some other way. Who's the authoritative on what these libraries are supposed to be called? So going in that direction, probably not where we want to be.
Could be interesting to see, but I think, isn't that partially to a degree when a corporation gets involved? Well, let me rephrase that. When a for-profit entity gets involved, right? I mean, we're able to do so much stuff for free, and I know we've got not OpenSSL, but Let's Encrypt and things like that to improve the security space. But I think really at the end of the day, there's only so much those of us who are doing it for free or volunteering are going to put our neck out there, versus someone who's actually trying to make money on it. Then they've got an actual reason to drive further.
So and again, that gets to, what are we trying to do? If we're trying to catch bad guys doing things to our community, that's exactly where in security, we've learned, okay, a security company will devote some of their budget for finding this stuff, for doing this security research, and in exchange, we recognize their booth logo, and we're more likely to go and use them and pay for their broader services. That's one part of it. Another part is just saying, what are the things that need to be centralized and what can't, right? There are so many things that would be lovely to say, let's have this global model for, that we simply can't do. And I'll give you an example of where we're encountering it as we try to think through, as a community, this idea of SBOM, is naming. Naming is a known hard problem in all of IT. For the last 40 years, we've successfully solved the global namespace problem exactly once. And that's DNS, and the annual budget for ICANN is about $140 million. Right? We don't have that kind of resources to do this. For software, it's actually tricky, because there's so many ways of thinking about names. There was a survey of 10 of the large tech companies use 5 different names for Apache web server. Another great example is just your own records, right? Do you use com.sun.java or com.oracle.java? Well, it just depends on when you started keeping your records. Easy for us to tell, but if you're trying to build an automated system that can do this kind of mapping, you're going to need some way of doing this. And so one of the things we're trying to figure out is, how do we solve the problem of software namespace? It's going to look a little bit like federation, where we just say, okay, this corner of the world, it just needs to be unique inside this. You can have 2 identical packages, but one's in Node and the other one's in some other place. But we're also going to need somewhere along the line, someone's going to have to step up and come up with an alias list that's trusted. And that's where you get to your large corporations, or dare I say it, perhaps even government, because that's the sort of public good that perhaps we can find some folks to shell out some funds to support.
Yeah, and detecting bad libraries is a very interesting area of research, and I've done some research in it. And you're right, you do need some kind of central authority, I think, is one of the missing pieces to the puzzle potentially today, right? I think Linux distributions have done a pretty good job, although there have been people who are able to impersonate or inject packages into Linux distributions. When it comes to languages where anyone can write a library and people can adopt it and install it, you have to go to the point of installation. And are there intelligent things that we can build in or have available to everyone, right? If you look at typo squatted libraries as an example, I mean, I think someone could probably pretty easily write a program that looked at names that were similar and then compared code bases and then said, well, if this one's named closely to this one and they share more than 80% of the code base, except the differences are this one calls out with a backdoor with your SSH keys. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to know that, right? It can just do the analytics. And if we start building this intelligence into a lot of these frameworks and making it available to them, again, it comes down to resources in that overall kind of governing body, right, for open source.
Hey, anyone out there want to write a weekend project?
Right.
Strongly encourage that. I think it's the sort of thing that a lot of people would pick up and use.
Yeah. And it looks like some frameworks have like gone down paths and then kind of stopped. And you wonder if it's just really resource constraints. And also they've got a lot of other things on their plate, right? They've got bug fixes, they've got features, they've got infrastructure to maintain, the whole thing.
And I think it depends a little bit on which types of communities want to provide that, right? So in Node, I think, is an example where there is some global perspectives there. There are just others like Python, which is much more distributed, much more decentralized. And so the only strength that we as defenders have is because the data is public, you can build some tools that automatically scan for this sort of thing, which is how we ultimately went after typo squatting.
Right. And, I mean, go ahead, John.
You know what's sort of interesting? In some of the more mature IT orgs out there, we have these. I'll censor myself, but I'll say wonderful proxies which limit what we're able to access from the internet as developers, and can we download directly from Docker Hub or from anywhere out on the internet, right? It's a little harder though to track down and limit what language someone's using or what libraries they're using. So I think that's it becomes a little more sort of finicky. How do you stop that, as we were just talking about the weekend project, right? Someone had an idea. I usually say 2 o'clock in the morning. How do you stop that from suddenly being a credit card swipe somewhere else or leave money out of it? Some of these things become, I think, a little harder to manage.
And this is why we've tried to frame this as a supply chain issue, which is how do we empower downstream customers to start asking these questions upstream. And again, this is third-party assessment is an exploding area right now. I don't want to burden more people with yet more things, and please fill out this survey before you can work with me. In fact, fun side story, the medical device community was so sick of every different hospital having a different set of third-party assessment tools that they went and wrote their own. So the medical device community gave it to their customers to say, here are all the questionnaires that you can make us fill out so that they can standardize it. What I like about an SBOM is it's technical data that you can then go and look at. And if you have the software on-prem, you can even do some verification yourself, or you can require that your supplier, your vendor do use some tools. And then you can start to ask those questions yourself, or at least demand that they think through some of these things.
Allan, what resources does the Department of Commerce have today on this topic, and kind of highlight some recent areas of your work?
So the fun news is we are trying to do this as a non-regulatory process. So the work we've done is we have convened this group. It is a multi-stakeholder process, and if you roll your eyes at that term, I'm the guy who has to say it like 18 times a day. But the vision here really is we convene. So we don't have money that we're handing out. But the trade-off is I also am trying to race ahead of regulators. We know that there's some regulators that are interested in this for different sectors, whether it's healthcare, whether it's energy, or even just more general government purchasing rules, which is going to bring this to the community. our vision here is to say, let's try to get the community ahead of time and develop it on our own terms. So that means that it's a public, it's open, anyone can join, it's transparent. But it also means that our work is only as good as these smart people who want to show up and have a little bit of time to get engaged. So right now we've got 4 documents that were published last month, defining the very basics of an SBOM. It's sort of what is an SBOM, why we should do it, documenting, here's how it creates value, whether you make software or buy software or operate software. Here's some of the standards that we've identified so that we don't have to write a new standard for this. Let's use what we already have. And then there's what I think of as, so we've got the what, the why, the how, and then what I call the screw it, we'll do it live, where the healthcare sector actually said, we want this, we need this, we're going to just do a proof of concept to show that it's possible. So those documents are out there. But right now, what we need are some folks from the software community, from the application development community to say, oh, this seems interesting. Let me tell you why it's a problem in this corner of the world. Or even better, if you like it, learn about it, give a talk at a conference. We're going to be working on creating, a golden deck of slides, one-pagers. So if this is something that is interesting to anyone out there, this is a chance to actually get involved in shaping a tiny revolution in how software is made and sold. There's still a lot of open questions we're thinking about, such as naming, such as the challenge of vulnerability versus exploitability, right? There are lots of times where it's okay to use a slightly outdated library because the way you're using it, you're not calling the vulnerable function, so it's okay. How do we think through that? And in the SaaS world, one of the things we're trying to think about is not just how do we encourage people who are making software to track their components, but what's the value to your customer for having this information, right? If you can provide, here is the list of all the components that are being used in our real-time build, how will that help them make a better decision about why they can securely use your software?
Allan, it's great stuff. The links to the resources that you mentioned are in the show notes, wiki.securityweekly.com. Allan, thank you so much for appearing on Application Security Weekly.
It's a real honor. Big fan of the work that you guys do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, take a short break, cover the news for this week in application security. Stay tuned.